This week on The Futurists, Charlie Stross.
The human world in 50 years' time, even if it's still standing and we still have civilization technology, is going to be unrecognizable, with an awful lot of capital cities no longer inhabited or viable and new ones replacing them.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm joined by my co-host, Rob Tursek, and we have an amazing guest for you guys today. Charlie Stross, born in 1964, is a full-time science fiction writer and resident of Scotland. That makes him part of a very exclusive club. Not many people can live off publishing these days. He's an author of at least 6 Hugo-nominated novels, winner of the 2005 Hugo Award for Best Novella, which was The Concrete Jungle. Of course, I'm a big fan of his space operas, The Laundry Files. Stross has also had his work translated into more than a dozen languages. He's worked as a pharmacist, a software developer, and a journalist for the technology industry. Let's welcome Charlie Stross to the show.
Charlie, hello, and welcome to The Futurists.
Thanks for having me here.
We're excited to have you here. You've been someone that we wanted to speak to for quite a while. You know, in this show, we tend to talk to people who are working on the future. A lot of them are technologists. Sometimes they're consultants or strategists. But we have our fair share of science fiction authors as well. And one of the things that I liked about you is that you introduced yourself as a person who tells lies for a living. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, that was to some extent a joke, but it's an accurate joke because, let's face it, fiction is lies that are intended to entertain.
Yeah.
And you stick your hat out on the pavement as a storyteller and hope people flip coins into it, or the modern equivalent.
The same could be said for many professions. You know, if you consider it right now, we have a national election happening here in the U.S., and you could say politicians are people who tell lies for a living. And then again, so are priests and ministers. So there are many people who share that proclivity.
Oh, that's fighting words, Rob.
And I'd also add to that the C-suite of every AI startup that's now looking for money. All of them.
We're on the cusp of AGI. And yes, exactly.
Spicy
so part of that is selling, right? Part of that is just you're conjuring up a vision that's so enchanting that people want to believe it will be true. Of course, for a professional author, that's the job, right? That's the job. You're making a vision of a world that people want to imaginatively project themselves into.
Yeah. Professional fiction writers are at least honest liars. You know, we don't pretend to be telling the truth about the future, which gives us a certain license to get creative with it. So it's only by accident when we actually do predict something that's actually plausible. It shouldn't be a surprise if I assert that basically 90% of science fiction today is essentially fantasy. If it has faster than light travel in it or time travel, it's fantasy. These are not really compatible with the known laws of physics. Again, lightsabers, show me how they work. You know, if they were workable, I'm pretty sure the US Department of Defense would have a bulk order for several million of them in, and so on.
Now, do you trouble yourself with those with physics and the verisimilitude and the ability to conform to laws of science, or do you relieve yourself of those obligations and simply write what's in your mind?
Yes and no. It depends on what I'm trying to achieve. For the past pretty much decade, although I'm coming back towards more traditional science fiction in the near future, I've been focusing on basically urban fantasy, or rather a rather tortured version of urban fantasy, which doubles as political satire, largely triggered by Brexit, Trump, and who the hell knows where this decade is going. From halfway through the previous decade, things just went completely nonlinear and unpredictable for a while. Having said that, when I'm writing SF, I often try and go into a predictive mode where I try to stay within spitting distance of the rules and use those rules as guardrails to funnel my imagination into coming up with something plausible but second-order consequences that nobody else has thought of yet. For example, back in 2005, which is going back quite a long way, I heard some interesting anecdotes about massively multiplayer online computer games, which were the big thing back then. Think World of Warcraft, think Second Life for somebody actually trying to build the metaverse and not spending $100 billion on it like Facebook. I began hearing some interesting rumors about them, including a pub conversation with a somewhat shell-shocked IT guy who told me about a fellow who walked into a police station in North London to report a crime. I'd been robbed, he said. Oh, what's the thing? Well, this bloke sold me a magical sword on eBay and it wasn't magic. And it turned out, after a very confused police officer finally got to the bottom of the story, that he had in fact been the victim of a crime. The crime was not robbery, though. The crime was fraud. He'd been sold what was supposed to be an enchanted weapon in a computer game for real money, and it turned out not to be. At which point I began looking into the economics of games and discovered, to my surprise, that they were in fact already interchangeable with real-world cash. And began asking myself, what are the implications of large amounts of trade happening in virtual worlds, which are interchangeable with real world? And that ended up as a novel called Halting State, which came out in 2007, and which was my surprise breakthrough novel after 10 books. Because oddly, nobody had looked at it from that angle before. And that's one example of it. Another, looking in a different direction, Neptune's Brood, which came out in 2013, I think. Or was it 2012?
Yeah, 2013.
2013. It's a far future novel set, well, several thousand years in the future, in a universe in which interstellar travel and colonization has happened much slower than light. Transit speeds max out at about 2% of the speed of light. Because, of course, for people doing the interstellar colonization, they may run human neural wetware, but they're not actually physically human anymore. And I began asking, what kind of economic system would support interstellar colonization when you have a payback time measured in centuries to millennia?
I've actually done a keynote presentation on your economic theory on this, Charlie.
Tell us about
it. I kid you not. I kid you not. I could talk you through it later, but yeah, yeah, keep going.
But for your listeners, the main thing that I got onto at that point was, and what form of fraud does such an economic system become susceptible to?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the novel goes. It's told from the point of view of a historian of accountancy fraud practices, basically, who's on the trail of the biggest fraud in human history, one so big that the perpetrators had to colonize 200 new star systems to launder the proceeds.
Whoa. Nice. That's thinking on a grand scale. You know, it's an interesting thing. Even as we talk about fiction and building fictional worlds, even money as a concept is a kind of fiction. It's probably the most widely accepted fiction in the world. The notion that this piece of paper or this metal disc has some value that you can use and share it with other people and trade for real world goods or food or something else. I think it's Yuval Noah Harari who made a big point about that, but it's a really relevant point here. We use our imagination to envision future possibilities, and then those future possibilities can come true. Once we've envisioned it, we can actually go about building it. Maybe not the interstellar travel that you're referring to. Maybe that's a little too ambitious for our state right now, but it gives us something to aspire towards.
Well, we are talking about sending, micro spacecraft driven by, photons to Alpha Centauri, to Proxima B, I guess. We are within grasp of technology that could get us to the nearest star systems. And I just watched another presentation on James Webb. We're now looking at other star systems in greater detail than ever before. We've found rogue binary, free planets, as they're now calling them, that have been ejected into nebulas and stuff. It's a very interesting time for learning about the universe. But Charlie, I wanted to talk about your world setting and how much your sort of worldview informs this, because unlike other sci-fi authors that delve into fantasy, you've tend to go into sort of Lovecraftian spy versus spy, stuff with your Bob Howard novels and so forth, the Q division. But we are starting to see a lot more theory around sort of quantum consciousness and multiverses and things like that, and the thought that maybe these ghosts and things that we've talked about are some sort of multidimensional creatures. Are you that sophisticated in your worldview, or is it just like it's just fantasy, guys?
I was trying to keep one hand on the steering wheel while driving in that direction. But what I was trying to achieve with those books, and still am to some extent, is some introspection about how power structures work in the human world and how we deal with much bigger and vaster than human intentional beings. Here in the real world, even if we don't have Lovecraftian elder gods hanging around, we have to live side by side with corporations and governments. All of us are superorganisms. I mean, a human being is basically a shambling pile of several trillion cells marching in formation. The cells, in turn, have organelles within them that appear to have had independent lives at some time in the past. For example, the mitochondria that provide us with energy. We are, in a very real way, the organelles and cells from which nations and corporations are made up. And these entities do not have our best interests at heart any more than you can reasonably claim to have the best interests of any individual neuron or blood cell in your own body at heart. They don't care what happens to us as individuals. Elder gods make a really powerful metaphor for exploring this, and also for dealing with vast impersonal forces, which is sort of the rabbit hole I went down with the Laundry Files as a series, when it's not playing cheeky games with critiquing different strains of urban fantasy, for example.
Yeah.
One of those novels, to give an example, one of those novels, the Rhesus chart starts with the sentence, "Don't be silly, Bob," said Mo. "Everybody knows vampires don't exist." So guess what the entire novel is about?
Vampires.
Of course. And the fact that they all work in major investment banks in the city of London should not be a shock.
You made the point.
That's where I went with. That's where I went with that series. Until, as I said, we ran into a huge political upset in the middle of the last decade. Brexit happened, and I then got this idea of, wouldn't it be an interesting tool to use this odd paranormal fantasy series to stress test or torture test the British system of government in the wake of the Brexit referendum? What happens if you have a soft coup d'etat in the UK in which the Prime Minister is replaced with a literal elder god who wants to ultimately eat us, and the machinery of government and bureaucracy keeps chugging along underneath him? What would this look like?
Look like the Trump administration.
Like a second Trump administration.
I wasn't going to go there.
Well, it's fair game, though, right? Because look, right now, my take, at least on the U.S., but I think this might also be true of the U.K. during that Brexit debate, is people want to be lied to. At least some percentage of the electorate prefers a fictional version that is absolute falsehood and easily proven. They prefer that to the real thing because the real world problems are intractable, difficult. They're going to require compromise. They won't get you closer to perfection, and they won't necessarily satisfy everybody. And so they prefer a fictional world where they can have it all. And right now we're seeing an example.
But that's just cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance, right? It's like just sort of reinforcing worldviews, and politicians do that all the time. They have done for a long time,
Yeah, but there's something new in the world now, which is people who are suffering for one reason or another. And the protest votes in both Brexit and for Trump are indicative of the suffering. People are suffering who want to inflict pain on the people they perceive as having caused the suffering. They want to hurt them, and they will vote for whoever promises to hurt them hardest. This is one of the tactics of fascism.
Cruelty is the intention, right? Cruelty is the point of some of the policies. Yeah. That's certainly the approach we're taking with immigration in the United States. The United
Oh,
States famously, our birth rate is declining, like many northern countries in the northern hemisphere. The only reason the United States population keeps growing is immigration, and it's a proven fact that immigration keeps our economy going. It keeps our economy quite strong, and it also keeps us quite vital. And yet, there's a group that simply doesn't want to share this place with anybody else, and so they want to fight immigration. But that's not enough. They actually want to impose a kind of torture on the people who are coming across the border, maybe to deter others, or maybe it's just a kind of revenge. This is a very strange policy. I find it very, very dark.
it's exactly the same in the UK. The
Well,
UK,
it's happening right now in Paris with the Olympics because they're blaming, immigrants for the thefts and stuff in Paris during the Olympics. It's, but look at the US with the Chinese exclusion law. Look at Australia with the White Australia policy. I mean, like, this is not something new. Immigration's
are
being
you?
used as a political
No,
bludgeon.
but Brett, you're missing
Are
the
you?
point. I think maybe it's because we're having a little bit of delay. What Charlie's referring to is a policy of intentional cruelty, not just a
Yeah.
policy that bars people based on race. The
Right.
old
Okay.
policies that you
Yeah,
mentioned
I get that.
are
I
that
get
for
that.
sure,
I get
and
that.
that is a kind of
It,
cruelty.
it doesn't have to be efficient, it has to be performative. I don't know if you guys are
Right.
familiar with the Rwanda deportation program in the United Kingdom.
No.
This is something
Oh
the
yes, I
Conservatives.
am. Yeah. They were putting them on planes, and then the plane didn't work or something. It was
Okay,
a
it
real.
turns out they had spent upwards of £500 million building infrastructure in Rwanda to hold them, detention centres in the UK to hold them before they could be shoved on planes and shipped off to Rwanda, backhanders to various individuals in the Rwandan government. I will add, the Labour Party, to their credit, cancelled the whole thing on their first day in office. It turns out that the amount budgeted for deportations to Rwanda was £7 billion. They had deported a grand total of 5 people so far. This was not a viable policy in any way. It would literally be cheaper to give each individual asylum seekers, and these are fugitives from repression, it would be cheaper to give them £1 million each in cash and tell them to go somewhere else. And, with £1 million in your pocket, you can buy an investor visa at most places.
Right. So this is what you mean by
true.
performative. The people making these decisions want to be seen by their constituents as inflicting harm. What a strange turn of events. It's a little bit hard for me to understand how we arrived at this place. 20 years ago, I don't think I would have forecasted that this is the state that we'd be in. I wouldn't have forecasted that the EU would be under such pressure, or NATO would be under such pressure. Those things seem to be working quite well. So there's also this kind of a collective amnesia about what works. We take it for granted. Maybe we get complacent. Another example of that is the resistance against vaccination. This is no doubt one of the most successful public health policies of the 20th century, an unqualified success in terms of stopping infectious disease. And yet we've got this rampant pride. Again, it's another performative thing, and people are proud to share with others that they are rabidly anti-vax. I find this very peculiar because it's not just unscientific. It's about saying, I don't need to comply, and you all can solve the problem for me.
It's also self-defeating, though,
Yeah. Can I add, there's a couple of things feeding into it. One is, if a policy is successful at avoiding a harm, people discount its importance. So, for example, people with no experience of mumps or measles or rubella assume that vaccinations don't matter because they haven't seen people getting ill and dying of it around them. Again, the Y2K bug, the millennium bug, back in 1999 onwards, it was a really, really big thing in IT. And I was working in an internet payment service provider dealing with banks, and they were panicking like crazy. Lots of people working a lot of overtime fixing stuff. And then finally, on January the 1st, 2000, very few things actually broke. And today, I hear politicians who should know better saying it was all just a hoax.
Yeah.
And, I despair of this because these are necessary precautions to prevent bad stuff happening.
As Rob mentioned, like vaccines, the single most, according to the American Medical Association, vaccines are the most effective medical intervention humanity's ever come up with. And so you say, well, we look at the COVID, the anti-vax movement within COVID, but then it actually goes back to the MMR, as you said. What was his name? Andrew
Wakefield, who, in my
Wakefield,
opinion,
that's right.
should be in prison for what he did.
Yeah.
Right. But it started this trend of saying it's okay to discount these vaccinations. And it's like, but this is like the best thing that we've ever come up with to deal with pandemics and diseases.
It goes back further. It goes back to the 19th century, the early 19th century. In fact, the history of vaccination, it really wasn't invented in the West. It goes back to practices in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century and earlier. But when it first came to the UK, or was first acknowledged in the UK, a doctor called Edward Jenner began inoculating people with pus from cowpox disease, which caused
Not a great story.
which caused an attenuated form of the disease, but wasn't as disfiguring or as fatal as smallpox. And the British government of the day tried to make it compulsory and caused a huge amount of ill will. And a lack of public education didn't help either. And this was sort of in the early 19th century. So when what Wakefield did basically stirred the embers of an earlier mistrust of authority in general. And I'm also seeing that in other areas right now. You ask where the rise of right-wing sentiment comes from. I think there are very powerful political actors at work in the world who discovered that they can wage asymmetric warfare against various Western governments and against each other by spreading lies using the internet. I mean, proverbially, fake news is a thing. We've all seen it around us. The scale it's on, though, is mind-boggling.
Yeah. It makes science fiction look trivial by comparison.
Yeah. There's
absolutely.
Now, there was one that came out a few weeks ago from the Pentagon, of all people, who should have known better. They began spreading lies about Sinovac, the Chinese COVID vaccination in 2020-21, including in the Philippines.
That was a deliberate campaign.
Yeah. But it is almost certain that the Chinese and Russian governments are spreading similar lies about Western vaccines and other practices in the West. The whole thing has been used for political advantage by very short-sighted military and political actors around the world to take short-term advantage over their enemies. I mean, we may look at Trump as having boosted the idea of using ivermectin, a horseworming treatment, as a cure for COVID for his own personal gain. We similarly saw various British ministers making bank of contracts for COVID personal protective equipment, some of which are being investigated as serious criminal fraud. The same has been happening everywhere around the world. And I just want to despair because these people seem to think that they themselves are invulnerable.
Yeah, what they're doing by eroding consensus is they're making withdrawals on a bank account, if you will. It's like we have a communal savings account where we build trust, and we build trust in systems, and we build trust in government, and we build trust in the functionaries that run the government. And by attacking the state or by attacking those systems or creating doubt or chiseling away at the veracity of those claims or undermining them with rumors and innuendo, they're actually making withdrawals on that bank account. That's taken us many, many decades to build up. Okay, that's a little bit dark for an opening section for the show. Charlie, before we go to break, we like to do some quick questions. Yes, so Brett is going to administer the poison here. He'll ask you a series of short questions, short answers.
All right. This is the lightning round. Okay, Charlie, what was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to? It could be a TV series, books.
Books, probably something by Andre Norton from my local library when I was 4 years old.
Right on, me too.
That's cool.
Sargasso in space.
What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
Ooh.
I should have sent you these in advance, but we like to make
it depends. It depends how you define technology. because really it's hard to get more of a change than taming fire.
Mm.
But that's
Yeah.
probably a bit too general for a future historian to talk.
It's all
I'm gonna
game.
go
It's
with-
all fair game.
Name someone that's influenced you in your writing and why.
This is probably a bit too focused, specific, and nerdish in SF terms, but I'd have to say Bruce Sterling, science fiction writer, futurist, now professor of design in Italy. During the late 1980s to early 90s, he's on a complete tear with some of the most terrifyingly effective evocations of near future change I've ever seen in a genre. He knocked the ball out of the park several times over in his career, not just once. The weird thing is, he was always moving on to new fields. So, for example, in his novel Schismatrix, published in about 1988, he basically invented what is today known as the new space opera in one book, and then walked away, leaving the whole field to everybody else, and did something else. And a couple of years later was writing Heavy Weather about storm chasers in a post-climate change North America. Remember, that was in around 1990.
94. Yeah.
As I say,
we had
and he launched Wired magazine in that same time frame. So he was also banging out good journalism as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Prolific.
Very
so
cool.
For about a decade, I used him as an object of emulation as to what do I want to do. See if you can reach this or exceed it. So there you go.
All right. What's the best prediction or forecast you think a science fiction author has ever made?
We're not really in a predictive medium. That's the problem. Science fiction isn't about prediction. We're an entertainment medium. If we predict something, it's usually by accident, with a million monkeys banging away on typewriters, and eventually somebody's going to write Shakespeare. So I'm not sure what the best prediction would be, but there were a couple of American pulp authors who wrote short stories in the period 1942 to 45 who were actively investigated by the FBI because they were talking about atomic weapons.
Wow.
And came close enough for the government to get slightly alarmed. Is this a leak?
Interesting. All right, final one, and then we got a break. What science fiction story is most representative of the future you hope for?
I think we're beyond hope at this point, or close.
Increasingly, our guests would be agreeing with you.
This is like the post-apocalyptic edition of the Futurists. All right, on that note, let's take a little break. We're going to be back in just a minute, folks. Please listen to our sponsor messages, and we will be right back with Charlie Stross on the Futurists.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey there, welcome back to the Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick with my co-host Brett King, and this week we're talking to sci-fi author Charlie Stross. Charlie, tell us, what does the future hold for a science fiction author? What's in your near future?
Well, my near future, really, I've got nothing coming out in 2024, but in 2025, my publishers have decided to call it the year of the laundry files, because I have 2 books coming out next year, and a second edition of a tabletop role-playing game as well. But the first of those books is published on January the 7th next year, A Conventional Boy. And it's my novel about the satanic Dungeons and Dragons panic of the 1980s.
Oh, yeah.
Because I don't know if you remember it, but D&D caused a bit of shock and outrage, especially among the Christian right and the evangelicals in the 1980s. And they began going after D&D players and trying to get the game banned, or it was all part and parcel of the satanic ritual abuse panic at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And as the Laundry Files is sort of an urban fantasy series that examines how the British government would deal with magical or paranormal threats, I thought, how would they have dealt with the satanic D&D panic of the 1980s? And I think it's safe to say the answer in one word is badly. So our protagonist is, well, when he was rounded up by the government and taken to a black site for interrogation, he was a 14-year-old dungeon master. He's now a 48-year-old lifer from the government's internment camp for Lovecraftian cultists when he's running the camp newsletter because he's a trustee. You know, they know he's not really a danger to anyone at this point. They've had him for 30 years. He gets 2 bits of news one week. The first is the camp is going to be closed down and he's going to be moved out. They're rebuilding it under a public-private partnership for the Stars Coming Right and a massive influx of new prisoners. And he'll be brought back as a member of staff to run the camp newsletter, but it's not going to be the same as the place he's spent the majority of his life in.
Mm.
The other bit of news he gets that day is there's a gaming convention coming to a town just down the coast. And Derek has had a foolproof escape plan for 20 years, but nowhere to go with it, because this is his home. He's finally decided that he's going to break out and go to a gaming convention at least once before his 50th birthday. And all sorts of havoc is set in motion by this decision of his.
And again, tell us the title and when the book will be published.
It's A Conventional Boy, and it's coming on January the 7th. Simultaneous publication in the United States and the UK.
Right on. All right, good. We'll have that to look forward to. You were an avid gamer. That was actually kind of how you got started in science fiction, wasn't it? You started to explore fictional worlds. I mean, in some respect, that Conventional Boy was you.
To some extent, yeah. I was writing D&D scenarios and DMing in my teens. Some of my first publications were monsters that are still out there now, causing havoc and annoying players. I'm to blame for the Gif Yankee, if you've ever run into them, in Baldur's Gate. That's my fault. And
did you ever run into any Satanists? Was that part of the protocol, or was that not?
Not really. I pretty much gave up D&D 40 years ago now, but it sort of still lingers with you like a bad hangover.
My son has just really got into it lately, and I remember playing it at school when I was his age. So it's got real longevity. You know,
it is generational.
Like kids
sort of
now are
back.
really, definitely getting into it right now.
It's funny to me how the keepers of the mythologies are so suspect about new mythologies or new entertainment mythologies. It's an interesting dynamic that we have in our society. You both frowned when I mentioned that in the beginning comments, in the opening comments, but you see, we're coming around. I knew we would eventually come around to that. Hey, Charlie, something else I want to come back to, because you mentioned it briefly earlier in the first segment. And also you mentioned it in a couple of your talks that I find quite interesting. Folks, if you go to Charlie's website, antipope.org, you say that we already have artificial intelligence, that corporations are a kind of super intelligence. And I know there's some very literal-minded people who focus on computer science who would object to that statement because it's in on those artificial intelligence is a discipline of computer science, though that's contentious. Tell us what you mean by that statement when you say that we've got corporations that are super intelligences.
Corporations are goal-seeking entities. They're structured. They exist in an environment where they interact with other corporations and with human beings, and also with the natural landscape around us. They have their own set of priorities and needs. A corporation that stops being revenue positive and ends up in debt for too long will die. It will cease to exist. Corporations predate on each other. They absorb one another in takeovers. Their life expectancy, once they're established, is probably about half that of a human being, about 30 years, although 50% of startups go bust within their first year or two of existence. There are some that have been around for a very, very long time, though. They are potentially close to immortal. I think the oldest existing companies of this kind are multiple centuries old. And the thing is, what corporations want and what human beings want are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Corporations don't generally reproduce naturally. They don't have children as a rule, although they can occasionally spawn spin-offs. A classic example of a spin-off would be Boeing spinning off Spirit Aerosystems to make parts for Boeing airliners about a decade and a half ago. They don't always stay viable. And the thing is, the goals of corporations are not necessarily in line with the goals of the human beings they coexist with. A corporation that causes massive pollution, which dumps heavy metals into the living environment around its workforce's homes, for example, it may be paying those workers a living, but it's also poisoning them. And no
The
individual
interesting thing, Charlie,
corporation-
is that you mentioned that these corporations and even nation states are comprised of people. People are the component parts. They're kind of an assemblage of different personalities, different human personalities. But what's fascinating to me is that when you work in a corporation, you begin to take on the intentions and the values of that organization, even if they're opposed to your own. And I'm thinking specifically here of corporate attorneys. So you may have a corporate attorney who in his regular life perhaps doesn't love the excessive power and the overreach that corporations have. But when he goes to work, that person is going to work assiduously to try to enhance or extend the corporate power. And we see that happening constantly, at least in this country. We see that happening constantly. The corporation is ascendant, and it has been my entire lifetime in the United States. And that is because the people who work within it are doing their very best to advance the interests of the corporation, even if those interests go against their own family.
Exactly. Human beings are plastic. We absorb the demands of people around us to behave in a particular way. You can look no further than soldiers who, since time immemorial, have put themselves in harm's way or even gotten themselves killed because it was expected of them by the people around them, either by their peers or by their commanders. Workers in corporations are usually a rather milder dose of that sort of thing, but will often march in lockstep to do things that are highly detrimental to them personally. Sometimes to an extent where merely the size of the pay packet they're getting in return for it does not sufficiently explain the way they identify with a corporation. You must be familiar with Elon Musk fanboys.
Of course.
They're unavoidable.
They're unavoidable. And they seem to personally identify with this somewhat obnoxious multi-billionaire. It's hard to explain that in terms of, because, these are people who do not have any personal relationship with him. They've never met him. They might
He's just a meme at this stage.
Yeah, they might want to buy one of his cars, but he has become a totem representing a set of values that they hold dear. Human beings will do very strange things to reinforce their own values because they identify with things. Political allegiances are a lot like this as well. People will vote for a political party. Well, there's an ongoing joke on Reddit about the leopards eating people's faces party. I didn't mean to have my face eaten, says woman who voted for leopard eating people's faces party.
That's exactly. I tend to think a lot of people are almost like a blank slate or an empty vessel. People don't know what to think.
They just go with the wind.
Yeah, life is complicated, and so when someone comes along and it sounds like they've got simple solutions to complex problems, that's pretty attractive. It's really a choice to not have to think too hard or too deep about the complexity of society and of nature. That's unfortunately a cop-out. There are no easy answers.
I wanted to actually double down on this, Charlie. So, you wrote a blog called The Coming Storm Part 2, right? And it connects with this conversation just a couple of weeks ago. You talked about the upheaval in politics and so forth. But the other really interesting theme that, again, has just come up in this conversation is really this, once in a century at least, energy transition with what's happening right now. And you talked about the explosion of solar and EV factories in China and so forth, while the US is fighting very heavily. We see Republican senators attacking Pete Buttigieg and so forth on TV about the failure of electric vehicles. That's a really strong message right now. But I wonder if your comments about the corporation, and this is something that Robert and I often talk about, but if this is more than just a change in dominant corporations that run these massive industries like the energy industry and the banking industry or healthcare, and whether or not this is a larger philosophical shift for humanity, that as AI and technology and automation and so forth gives us all of these new capabilities, that we need to find some other purpose other than just growth of the market. What are your thoughts on that front?
Well, the ideology of growth is long-term deeply toxic. Nothing grows forever. The nearest thing we've got to something that wants to grow forever is cancer. I mean, a cancer cell is simply a cell lineage in a human body that has lost the ability to limit its own growth so that it's compatible with survival of the superorganism. And eventually it kills it. But corporations don't recognize externalities that are detrimental to humans as being detrimental to themselves. They are blind to their component elements as a rule. Part of this emerges from corporations having no incentive to social responsibility.
So how do we fix that? How do we give them that incentive?
I don't know if we actually can. At the very least, we'd have to completely change the legal framework within which capitalism happens.
The
rules have been very largely gamed and bought by the people with the money, which turn out to be the corporate attorneys working on behalf of the corporations that have the money, not even the individuals. The global GDP is, I believe, on the order of $70 trillion a year. That makes any one billionaire, even Elon Musk, with a net value of about 200 billion, look poor. I suspect actual billionaires generally have as much of a sense of helplessness before global change that we do, just on a bigger scale. They also have more to lose if things go wrong, so they probably fight harder against it. But they're not particularly bright. They were just in the right place at the right time. They're not particularly able to affect change on a planetary scale or even a national scale. So, they're prone to all the same vices that we are, just writ large.
One thing that we like to do on the show, Charlie, is we like to get a bit sci-fi at the end of the show. We like to talk about the far future, and you've written obviously, for the far distant future, but maybe give us your thoughts about what you think. For our vintage, our age, what changes are we likely to see in the next 20 or 30 years? Putting your sci-fi hat on, that you think are, something that interests you or inspires you or gets you out of bed in the morning?
Okay, first things first. I suspect the Silicon Valley venture capital-backed model of investment and technology is going to crash very, very hard in the next decade or two, possibly in the next year or two even. The massive investment bubble in AI that's inflating at a ridiculous rate, far faster than the dot-com bubble did in the 90s, is one possible rupture point. It might keep going after that, but a huge amount of capital is going to evaporate at some point. It's not actually building a usable, livable future for us. And sooner or later, they're going to run out of pension funds to loot. Having said that, we're also getting into the era of serious climate change. The Greenland ice cap is melting. The West Antarctic ice sheet may be beyond saving. The North Polar ice sheet is going to be ice clear year-round within the next decade or so. We're looking at massive sea level rises. Now, to give some context for that, Bangladesh, population 200 to 240 million, I forget which. 80% of that population lives less than 2 meters above sea level. The sea level rise within the next couple of decades will be more than 2 meters. So that's 250 million displaced people, for starters. If Bangladesh feels a bit distant and far away, London has flood defences, but they're inadequate for what's coming. And if you want to see a metropolis of 10 million people in the developed world flooded, London's there for starters, followed by New York, which already got it thanks to the storm surge and hurricane a few years ago.
And Miami already spends many weeks underwater every year.
520 capital cities exist in this 2-meter flood zone.
Yeah. The human world in 50 years' time, even if it's still standing and we still have civilization technology, is going to be unrecognizable, with an awful lot of capital cities no longer inhabited or viable and new ones replacing them. I say capital cities because a few years ago, we passed the point at which half the human population live in cities. Now, non-viable habitats as well, suburban sprawl in the US sense, only worked as long as there was cheap gasoline, no major climate change impact, as long as everybody could afford and could drive an automobile. I would foresee a trend being enforced by climate towards much more compact cities with much more apartment-oriented dwelling, probable municipal scale climate control and air conditioning to keep people from just dying of heat stroke. I'm not sure how we're going to go about keeping agriculture stable, though. As a friend of mine points out, climate change means more and more extreme weather events. Extreme weather events render agriculture non-viable. And if we lose agriculture, well, for the time being, we can ship food from one country to another and substitute one food source for another. But if all of them get hit simultaneously, it's game over for the human species. We had a mild taste of that in the UK last year because the potato harvest failed. The weather was much too wet, and the result is the price of potatoes has skyrocketed. Because it's a crop that tends to be grown locally in the UK and in Ireland as well. Let's not go into Brexit as well. No, actually, let's. The thing about Brexit is it was a decision by a political faction to ask a question they should never have asked, which got a massive protest vote against the people asking the question, as a result of which their successors followed through with shooting themselves in the head in terms of trade with their biggest neighbour. And the result is a huge impediment to trade in food. And we're getting that authentic late 1970s, early 1980s Moscow supermarket shopping experience in the UK.
Yes, yeah.
You go to a shop looking for food, and you've got to go to a couple of shops to actually find the stuff you need. And the quality is poor, and the stuff that's rotten by the time you get it home. And it's not much fun. And this was entirely avoidable. And the problem is that's going to be a universal experience in 20 years' time because, like I said, climate change, agriculture collapsing.
I have to admit, this is not what I expected us to talk about in today's show. Charlie, you come across as so upbeat and funny, but this we keep going straight into the gutter of the apocalypse here. You know, we've had David Brin on the show a couple of times, and David likes to remind us that we still have a chance, that humanity still has a chance to survive. How do you respond to that? Do you see it that way, or do you see it as unending vista of gloom and doom?
I think he's right, but it's going to be a bit of a nail biter for the next century.
Yeah.
There are some positive signs. The population bomb failed. It fizzled. It fizzled comprehensively. And in fact, a lot of our paranoia and political woes relating to migration are side effects of us globally dropping below replacement rate for population. It's now looking as if peak human population will be about 10 billion. I remember back when the projections were for 16 billion. They've been revised down constantly. And by the turn of this century, everywhere's going to look a bit like Japan or South Korea today, of the way China's going to be in 10 years' time, where the population is aging. this has its own economic challenges. It's inherently deflationary.
It is.
You have homes falling into disrepair. You have not enough workers to support the retiree base. Medical costs are spiraling because people in the last few years of life are very vulnerable and have multiple comorbidities. So it's going to be a very odd world from our point of view, one in which the illusion of permanent growth won't work. Going back a few years, I saw an op-ed in The Economist, of all places, pointing out that Japan's economic woes corresponded to the Japanese birth rate. But if Japan from the 1990s to the 2010s had sustained just zero population growth but no shrinkage, their economy would have averaged 4% growth per year. The Japanese economic malaise was due to the workforce actually shrinking.
And they have been famously not keen on immigration, whereas the EU, if we look at immigration in the EU over the last 20 years, the estimates are that GDP growth would have been 15% lower in the EU without immigration. So it's really interesting dynamic. But Charlie, this has been a phenomenal conversation. We're getting close. We've got to wrap the show, but for our listeners who want to follow what you're doing, learn about the books that are in the pipeline and stuff, what's the best way for them to keep in touch with you?
Okay, I do not do Facebook. I've abandoned Twitter because thanks to Dilbert Stark, it's no fun anymore. I'm all over Mastodon and Blue Sky. You can find me on Blue Sky as &C Stross. That's my surname with a C in front of it. And on Mastodon as cstross at wandering.shop, because Mastodon has different servers or instances.
Yep.
And I run a blog at antipope.org.
Perfect. An excellent blog that we both enjoyed.
Yeah.
Charlie, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. We're thrilled that you joined us. Thanks. And please, let's have you back again after this U.S. election.
I love that.
So we can indulge in further speculation.
Maybe we'll get you back on with David Brin or Kevin J. Anderson or something. We'll have a debate about something. That'd make it more interesting.
Well, Charlie, great fun having you on the show. And folks, thank you very much for listening. As always, we are grateful to our friends at Provoke Media, Kevin Hirschhorn, Elizabeth Severance, and the rest of the crew that make the show possible. We're also super grateful for the support of our fans and those who contact us on social media. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Every week, we'll bring you back. We'll bring you another person who is thinking about or actively shaping the future. And until then, Brett and I will see you
in the future.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.